Greetings. This is Joe Green, head pastor of St. Paul Missionary Baptist Church in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, also the founder of the 2019 movement. And I want to share a couple of thoughts with you. If you've been following the channel, if you've been following some of my teachings, and I just ask you if you'd be so kind as to hit like and subscribe and maybe share if any of this information is beneficial to you. We love to get the word out of some of the great content that I believe that God has us to share. But if you've been following it lately, we've been talking a lot about like critical race theory and different things. You hear me talk a lot about critical theory, and also how the narrative is being controlled. And so today I want to talk a little bit about toxic masculinity. So first of all, understand critical theory, and I'll just, for some of you are probably familiar with the term, some of you may not be familiar with it. So I'll give you a brief overview of what critical theory is. For us to start, it's always good to define terms as we start our conversation so that we're all on the same page. Critical theory is an approach to social philosophy that focuses on reflective assessment and critique of society and culture in order to reveal and to challenge power structures. With origins in sociology and literary criticism, it argues that social problems are influenced and created more by societal structures and cultural assumptions than by individual and psychological factors. So let me give it to you in a nutshell. So you had a group of people who were Marxists. It's all based on Marxism. So that Marxism, basically, ultimate goal is to control the masses. And I'm not going to get into specifically who it is that's behind Marxism, but it's to form a one world governmental system, to control the masses. It's a thing called hegemony, which is that certain groups of people are naturally supposed to rule over other groups of people. So they believe in hegemony, but they also believe that in order for them to properly get into their place of authority to make decisions for the masses and for the larger structure, that in order to have a violent overthrow or a violent revolution, it's too costly, right? So if you look at the Russian Revolution, if you look at some of those things that happened, China, when China took over, the communists took over in China, there were bloody revolutions. There were revolutions in Europe, bloody revolutions, right? For one group of people that thought that they rightfully should rule over the masses to gain control. And so they started to study psychology, and what they realized is that there was a better way of trying to gain power, to seize power. And so if you look at Aldous Huxley, he has a famous quote. He's the author of A Brave New World. And he talked about this desire for a group of people to rule over the masses. And he called it a revolution without bloodshed, or a revolution without tears. It means that in the future, they were planning on having a revolution to seize control and seize power, but without bloodshed, without tears, without violent wars. When the communists in China took over, it's estimated between 35 and 50 million people were massacred. When the Russians took over, millions of people took over. Even in the Nazis in Germany, millions of people were, in all these wars. In the 20th century, the number one cause of death for human beings is what's called democide. Democide is death by government, and primarily it's based on the Marxist takeover, or people that had the certain ideology that believed that they had the right to rule over the masses. And so anyway, they came up with a strategy on trying to seize control and seize power, and to have the masses actually give power over to them. That's where you get the idea. If you hear me mention hegemony. Hegemony is something you might want to look up, right, for yourselves. So how can they take over, right? How do they get people to willingly give up their power to another group of people? And Aldous Huxley says that the people will eventually love their servitude, or they will be in love with their servitude, right? So how does that happen? So it happens through what's called critical theory. And what critical theory does is it examines the institutions of society, and it looks to tear them down to reassert a different power structure. Now, what am I talking about? So they realized that in order for the Marxists to take over, the biggest hindrance to Marxist takeover was the Judeo-Christian Western culture, or Western society, right? So we live in America, Judeo-Christian Western culture. was the biggest threat or the biggest hindrance to Marxist takeover. Um, if you read the Communist Manifesto, you have Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, right? They're the authors of the Communist Manifesto, which is where we get the idea of Marxism from. When you understand that they recognize that the Judeo-Christian Western culture was the biggest threat to their takeover, right? That's why Karl Marx said his life's goal was to dethrone God and to destroy capitalism. So the Judeo-Western culture that's rooted in capitalism is the biggest threat to this takeover. So what they do is they examine all the various structures of the Judeo-Christian society, and they separate people into categories, and then they cause fighting between those two groups. But the fighting isn't to empower one over the other; it's to weaken the foundations of society in order for them to come and reassert their power. And so as they separate people into different groups, critical theory always looks at the established institution, criticizes it, separates people into oppressors and victims, and then it weakens the society in a way that they can come in and they can assert their authority. It's very clever. Hegel from Germany came up with the idea of the Hegelian dialectic, which is you've heard me, if you've listened to me, you've heard me talk about it a lot, which is problem, reaction, solution. It means that they cause a problem, they anticipate the reaction, and then they offer a solution. But also Hegel did something called, he was a part of what is called German idealism. So what German idealism is that it promotes this idea that words only have meaning for the one who's using the words. So how's that playing out? And I'm going to take a second to explain this. This is kind of off topic, but I think it helps the overall conversation. So for instance, gender, right? So nowadays people can define their own gender based on their own chosen pronouns, right? That's a form of German idealism, which means that the words only have meaning to the one who is using the word. Now that's really bad. Actually, it's also part of what's called postmodernism. But that's really bad because as a society to function and to be healthy, we have to have certain agreed upon words and foundational principles, right, in order for us to all come together, right? So if everybody just had their own reality that they were shaping and their own narrative, then it leads to insanity. Right. If we don't have any common starting point, that's why if you hear me do my talks, I always start my talks off with defining terms. So I want to define the term based on the actual definition of the term so that we can have a foundation of starting point. If I give you a word and my use of the word is completely different than your use of the word, then we're one person's talking about apples and the other's talking about oranges. You can never come to any kind of understanding, or you never get anywhere in that conversation. You're constantly saying something different, right? If I'm speaking in German and you're speaking in French and I don't understand French and you don't understand German, it's a pointless endeavor. And so we have to have common ground that we start off with. We have to have common definitions in order for us to get to a place of understanding in our conversation. So with that being said, German idealism talks about how we have to tear down the Judeo-Christian structure. Words are used to manipulate and control thoughts, which is why they change words and change meanings to suit their own purposes. And it keeps you in a constant state of it keeps you off balance, right? And so the one word I want to use, and let me say this before I give you the definition. And you in the thing I've been watching just clips of this gentleman by the name of Kevin Samuels. I think he has it's great conversational piece. He has a lot of positive things that he shares. It's good for people to know and understand what he's saying. I think a lot of people misinterpret it, take it out of context, because most of the things he's saying aren't new concepts. They're things that we've held for a while, but because of popular culture, what he's saying now is not very popular. Right, which is also political correctness is part of this whole thing that we're talking about when people want to, tear down the Judeo-Christian foundational principles, right? And so some of those institutions that we're talking about are traditional marriage, male and female roles, religion, what we consider to be uh, profanity, or not profanity, but like pornography versus modesty. Hedonism is one of the tools that they use. And what hedonism is, and you'll see this a lot in our culture, hedonism is the idea of you live your life and your ultimate goal is pleasure, right? Whatever makes you feel good. Like the old song, it's your thing, do what you want to do. I can't tell you, right? So that's a form of hedonism. So that promotion of hedonism, if you look in popular culture, especially pop artists, rappers, and different things, everything that they do on their Instagram, on their videos, everything is all about pleasure. It's all about partying, money, sex, drugs, or whatever the case may be. That's hedonism, which is another tool that they use in order to tear down the Judeo-Christian, Western Judeo-Christian structure. And so this guy, Kevin Samuels, he's going against what has become very popular, right? And another name I'm going to throw out there is President Donald Trump, and who is a lightning rod on many different issues. I'm going to do a different talk on why, when you look at President Trump, he simply stirred up trauma that's inside of people. So a lot of people were traumatized in various ways, and he just hit that button for people, which made them so emotionally angry with them at different times. And it was more of an internal thing than an external thing. But that's another talk. But anyway, the reason I'm mentioning all this is because you have this idea that of masculinity, of common masculinity, Judeo-Christian Western masculinity is wrong. And so they came up with this term called toxic masculinity. You'll hear this used a lot. Let me define that for you. Toxic masculinity involves cultural pressures for men to behave in a certain way, and it's likely this affects all boys and men in some fashion. Toxic masculinity refers to the notion that some people's ideas of manliness perpetuates domination, homophobia, and aggression. Now, you got to realize that homophobia is one of the things that we're talking about when you're talking about shaping language, right? Political correctness. This is a tool of manipulation and control. And so what do I mean by that? I mean like a term like homophobic or transphobic. These are words that they throw out there. Cancel culture. These are things that in order to reshape public opinion and to manipulate and control language in a way that manipulates and controls people's thoughts, right? So if I say that because of my Christian beliefs and what the Bible says, that natural marriage is a man and a woman, that's how marriage should be defined, they may call me homophobic, right? This manliness idea of men should be not manly, but be more effeminate. So they're promoting this idea of what's called a beta male as opposed to an alpha male, and toxic masculinity. So that term like homophobia, aggression, this idea that men need to act tough and avoid showing all emotions can be harmful to their mental health and can have serious consequences for society, which is how it became known as toxic masculinity, right? So let me take a pause here. And so they're equating our society's idea or traditional beliefs that men shouldn't cry or be very emotional, and they call that toxic masculinity. Now, what I'll say for the record is that I don't think that men should always hide their emotions. I'm a man. I cry at times. I show my emotions, and that's natural. But you have to understand that men are less emotional, and part of that is biology. If you look at the woman, that's why they say that women mature faster. Little girls mature faster than little boys. Physically, most of the time, young girls do, but also because the part of their brain that is associated with emotions develops more deeply than boys. That's just a biological fact. And so because women, the part of their brain so you have left brain versus right brain. I'm not going to get into that. Logic versus emotion. I'm not going to get into that right now. But what I'm saying to you is that a woman's brain, the part that's of the brain that's connected with emotions, are more developed usually in women than men. Now, you could have exceptions to the rule, of course, but that's why women are more emotional, right? When you think about hormones and different things like that, women are more connected to the emotional part of themselves than men, and that's biology, right? Now, I don't believe that men should never show emotion and they shouldn't cry. I tell my children and my son especially, I tell him I love him and I hug him often because I don't want him to get to a place where he has to be so, deadpan and can never be real with his emotions. But that's not what we're talking about here. They're talking about the manliness, the masculinity of men that's being challenged. What is toxic masculinity? It isn't about behaving like a man. Instead, it involves the extreme pressure some men may feel to act in a way that actually is harmful. This is what they're saying. So here's three primary elements that toxic masculinity deals with, right? So toughness. This is the notion that men should be physically strong, emotionally callous, and behaviorally aggressive. And so part of the strategy also is to mix a partial truth and twist truth, right? Because we know that men are naturally stronger than women. That's biology. Their bone structure, their muscle mass, etc. Men are naturally stronger than women. Now, of course, you can find the exception to the rule. So you can see someone like a Serena Williams, who is very muscular for a woman, and she's more muscular than a lot of men, right? She's the exception to the rule. But when you take men versus women, biologically, because of the testosterone, because of their bone structure, et cetera, the thing that makes them men, they are naturally stronger, physically stronger than women, right? That's not a good or a bad thing. That's a scientific biological fact, right? And that men are emotionally callous. So, of course, like we talked about, women are more in touch with their emotional side, and that's biology. It's not good or bad. It's just a fact of life. But of course, in this current culture, it makes it seem as though that you are that's some kind of hate speech, or that you're being misogynistic, right? So misogyny is another word that they use quite often. And it basically, a misogynist is a man who has little regard for women, or who's a sexist, basically. So they're trying to equate those two, right? They take the extreme examples and they try to use that as the rule, right? As instead of the exception to the rule. Another part of that is anti-femininity. This involves the idea that men should reject anything that is considered to be feminine, such as showing emotion or accepting help. So they're promoting this idea that if you show emotion or whatever, that you're being feminine. So they, of course, they take it out of context, take it to the extreme in order to manipulate. Are there cases when this is true? Absolutely. But that is not the rule, right? These are isolated incidences, and we should always look at isolated incidences for what they are, right? Deal with them as isolated incidents, not as the rule. And the third one is power. This is the assumption that men must work toward obtaining power and status, social and financial, so that they can gain the respect of others. Now, of course, these are dynamics that have been held for generations, right? And it's a natural, and I would submit to you, it's a natural desire that many men pursue that. And so this current culture didn't make men like that. Men have been like that traditionally. If you look throughout history, more men are the explorers. More men are the ones who help to come up with ideas to build cities and different things like that. Men are the ones primarily that go to war because of whatever reason they want to go to war for, or to gain power, or to rule over other people. That's kind of natural. I'm not saying it's a good thing, but that's natural. But what we're talking about here is trying to tear down that ideology to make it seem as though it's something that is false, as opposed to how people naturally gravitate towards those things. The other thing is what's called second wave feminism, and I'm going to talk about that. But I just want to get back to my initial comment. We have these people, and I'm glad to see people like Kevin Samuels, that these people they're reasserting certain aspects of manhood, right? And on his show, if you've never watched it, these women call into a show and they ask for, how can I get a high value man, right? They're talking about a wealthy man, a man who makes a lot of money, and he gives them honest feedback. And many times he criticizes their appearance, right? But they're asking for feedback. But see, what is happening because of how society is shifting and trying to emasculate men, what they're saying is that he has no right to say that. And that's absurd, right? So if someone comes up to you and they says, like, for instance, if I walked up to somebody and I said, do you think I need to lose a couple of pounds? And the person says, yep, you could lose a couple of pounds. I shouldn't get offended at them and say, that's horrible. Why would you say that about me? I've asked for the feedback if they're honest, or if someone, and here's a big deal, a big theme of his. These people want like a millionaire man, or man's making $200,000-300,000. And this is what they say, right? A man is making $200,000-300,000 a year or more, or something like that. And then he begins to tell them, or men who are like that, this is what their expectation is in women, and you don't meet those expectations, or these are ways that you can change. Now, the reason I'm tying all this together because it's this idea of what's called the second wave feminism. that really turns the tables on male female gender roles, right? It's part of the whole critical theory. And so you always set up a scenario where one group is the dominant group and the other group is the oppressed group, right? So in critical race theory, Black people are always oppressed. White people and white supremacy is always the dominant group, and they look to dominate and oppress Black people, right? In critical theory with male female relationships, right, with toxic masculinity, what it's trying to do is it's trying to say that men are always oppressing women, they're dominating women, and that women are always the victim in every scenario, right? So woman is never wrong. So in these interactions with these people, when women are asking for positive feedback, then they're getting it. And so because the woman is supposed to be some supreme being, then naturally they're saying he's wrong, that all women are beautiful. This is the scenario that they're trying to promote. All women are beautiful, no matter what their situation, no matter what their choices, no matter what their physical attributes. And you can't say otherwise, right? But that doesn't really do justice. If a person says, I want an honest opinion, I want some honest feedback, and this is what my goal is, then you should give them honest feedback. It's like me trying to sing, right? If I said I want to be a professional singer and that's in my heart's desire, and then I go around people and I sing and they tell me, look, you can't make it. You have a bad voice. You can't sing. You won't be able to make it as a professional singer. I need to receive that, right? I shouldn't say, well, that's wrong. You should never tell me that I can't sing or I can't accomplish anything. And so these are false narratives that's being promoted. So the last thing I want to talk about is second wave of feminism. And this is important, I think, for most of us to look at the women's movement. Now you have to separate the second wave feminism from women's suffrage, right? Those are two. That's why it's called second wave of feminism, right? So the first wave of feminism, and there was some historical figures. The lady who was involved with the Red Cross, and it'll come to my mind the name of the women. But anyway, the women's suffrage, when women were fighting for the right to vote, they were fighting for the right for equal rights, which women should have the right to vote. There were certain industries. It's just like it's just like back in the days during Jim Crow or segregation laws, that Black people were forbidden to operate in certain areas by law. You could say no Blacks allowed, right? Women, the same thing. There were certain times that women weren't allowed to own property or vote, right? So that's a real issue that women's suffrage tried to address, right? So women got the right to vote, I think is the 19th Amendment. But in any event, that's not what this is, right? Second wave feminism looks to emasculate men, right? And put the women in the dominant culture. And many times at the sake of men, oppressing men. And so it's important for us to really understand what these things are, because you'll see this more and more. That's why President Donald Trump was so villainized for different reasons, but primarily because he was what is known as an alpha male, right? And because alpha male or alpha manhood is looked down upon because of this current critical theory, toxic masculinity, second wave feminist agenda, any man who asserts himself as an alpha man is going to be villainized, right? They want to, emasculate men. They want to make men to be the submissive class and women to be the dominant class. This move, like say in the military and different places like that they want to push women, and this idea that women are just as capable as men. In many places they are just as capable as men, but you shouldn't be judged by your sex. So for instance, when you're training for combat, I was in the military. When you're training for combat, when you go to boot camp, they have certain stipulations you got to meet, certain requirements. Like, for instance, I had to do a certain amount of push-ups. I had to be able to run a mile and a half in a certain period of time. You have to be able to do pull-ups. Certain physical requirements. Now, it might not be as much now because, it's a lot of electronic warfare going on. But you figure when you were training people to be on the front line in battle, they should have certain physical requirements that they had to meet. Because if you're fighting against the enemy and it's hand-to-hand combat, the enemy is not going to take it easy on you because you're a woman. But by the same token, men had to meet those requirements as well. So I was in boot camp, and there were men who didn't meet certain requirements. They had to either they got set back in boot camp until they could meet them, or you had to meet certain physical requirements in order to be able to perform the duties. It's like a fireman. When a fireman goes to training, there's certain physical requirements that he has to be able to fulfill, where he can carry the equipment and do different things like that. And if they're not able to fulfill that, then they're disqualified. And that should go for men and women. Women shouldn't get special provisions because they're women, because at the end of the day, you have to meet these requirements in order to perform your job. And if I'm in a burning building and the fireman's coming to rescue me, I don't care if he's a male or female. I just want him to be able to fulfill his job, what he's trying to do, what he's trying to accomplish. That's all I want him to do, is come in and be able to rescue me when it's necessary. And so it's important. But let me talk about, I'm going to bring this to a close. Let me talk about second wave of feminism real quick. The women's movement of this 1960s and 70s, it's called second wave of feminism. Of course, I talk about the first one being women's suffrage and the right to vote and other basic human rights. It represented a seemingly abrupt break in the tranquil suburban life pictured in American popular culture. Yet the roots of the new rebellion were buried in frustrations of college-educated mothers whose discontent impelled their daughters in a new direction. So what happens is when you look at this, they're attacking the male patriarchy, what they call it. The idea that some women were housewives and men went off to work and earned a living. He was the breadwinner in the household. They're attacking all those different institutions. And traditionally what happened in ancient cultures, the women were the ones that would have the babies, and so it made sense for the men to be hunter gatherers. Right now in America, it's not quite the same, and women do have a lot more rights. They're very free and they have a lot of rights. But anyway, attacking that particular institution the way as making it as though it's wrong. So I know women, I know great families that the mother was a stay-at-home mom, right, which is a job in its own. The man was the breadwinner, right? That was a good way to do it. But what happens is the second wave feminism, they attack that as being evil and wicked, and somehow or another the man is dominating her and keeping her down. And that wasn't the case. I'm sure that there were cases where that was true, but overall it was out of necessity, because if a woman's having a baby, right, she's the one that's going to carry the baby. There's times that she's not able to physically do what she was able to do before. And once the baby is born, especially if the woman is nursing, right, and she's providing care for the baby, it made more sense for her to stay with the children. And nowadays with the rising cost of child care, a lot of times it made sense for families. So it's a personal choice. But what second wave feminism does is it attacks those type of institutional setups and acts like it's evil, or that's the reason why women are oppressed. It sends this idea, when I was in the 80s, you had this idea of women saying, I don't need no man, and even some women that decided to start families, that they didn't want to have a husband to do it. They just wanted to do it on their own, and these are all offshoots of the second wave feminism, which of course, as I said, is part of critical theory, which the intention is to break down the Judeo-Christian Western culture in a way that erodes a society, weakens individuals, and allows for a power shift so that those who adhere to the Marxist ideology can take over. So don't fall victim to these things. Again, a family is the most important piece, right? And traditional family values are something that the Judeo-Christian Western culture is known for. Is it perfect? Have there been blemishes? Are there other things that happen? Of course there are. But overall, that is the best possibility for society. And the Marxists recognize the strength in the Judeo-Christian Western culture in a way that causes them to promote all these agendas and all these ideologies in order to try to tear down society so that they can seize control and reshape it in a way that suits their benefit so that they can rule over. Until next time, peace and blessings to you. I'll be back with more videos. Please like it if you find some benefit to it. Share it if you will. I think that it's important times for us to have these discussions. Talk to you soon.